The K9 training facility sat just outside a small, quiet town in Mexico. It was a place where law enforcement dogs were trained to perform a variety of important tasks. From sniffing out illegal drugs to chasing down dangerous criminals, the dogs that came out of this facility were some of the best in the country. It wasn't just a place for training. It was a home for both the dogs and their trainers, a place where deep bonds were formed. Among the dogs, there was one that stood out more than the others. His name was Rex. Rex was a German shepherd with a striking appearance, strong and muscular, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to never miss a thing. He was one of the most skilled dogs the facility had ever seen. He was loyal, quick to respond, and had an instinct for detecting danger that was unmatched. Rex wasn't just any police dog. He was the best of the best. His trainers often spoke of him as if he were family, a partner in their mission to keep the town safe. The training facility was surrounded by vast fields, perfect for running and practicing drills. The dogs were trained to handle every situation imaginable, from searching vehicles for contraband to apprehending fleeing suspects. The trainers worked tirelessly with their dogs, always pushing them to their limits, but they did it with care. They knew that the bond between a dog and handler was essential for success. Trust was everything, and at this facility, trust was built through countless hours of training, care, and attention. For Rex, the training was a chance to prove himself. Every morning, he would wake up early, eager to begin his day. His handler, Carlos, was a former police officer who had transitioned to working with the K9 unit. Carlos had been with Rex since he was just a puppy, and the two of them shared an unspoken understanding. Rex was loyal to Carlos in a way that only a dog could be. They were a team, and together they had achieved great things. Carlos often marveled at Rex's ability to detect things that others couldn't. It wasn't just his heightened sense of smell, although that was impressive on its own. It was his instinct, his sharpness in moments of danger. Carlos had seen it firsthand when Rex saved his life during a dangerous drug bust. The memory of that day still haunted Carlos, but it also filled him with pride. Rex had been there for him when no one else could. Everything seemed peaceful at the facility that day. The morning air was crisp, the sky was clear, and the dogs were in high spirits. The trainers were running their usual drills, putting the dogs through various exercises to test their obedience, agility, and combat skills. Rex was in his element. He ran across the field with speed and precision, expertly navigating the obstacles set up for him. He was a picture of focus, his every move calculated, but in the distance, something was stirring, something that no one could have anticipated. The Cartel, a ruthless criminal organization operating in the region, had learned about the K9 unit. They knew the dogs were becoming a serious threat to their operations. The Cartel had seen how the K9s had helped the police intercept shipments of drugs and weapons. They were starting to feel the pressure, and they didn't like it. They had always been able to operate in the shadows, but the K9 unit was exposing their activities. The Cartel, desperate to maintain control over the area, decided to take action. They knew that destroying the K9 facility would be a direct blow to law enforcement's ability to fight back. If they could take out the dogs, the police would lose one of their most valuable resources. The cartel's leader, a man known only as El Diablo, gave the order to burn down the facility. It was a ruthless plan, one that would leave the town without its top K9 unit and send a clear message to anyone who dared to stand in their way. The cartel made their move under the cover of night. Armed men, disguised in dark clothing, arrived in unmarked trucks. They carried gasoline and fire-starting equipment ready to turn the peaceful training facility into nothing but ashes. Their plan was simple: strike hard, strike fast, and leave no trace of the dogs who had become such a threat. The wind was picking up as the cartel men approached, but the dogs were still out in the fields, unaware of what was about to happen. Rex, running through another training exercise, didn't sense the danger. He was focused, his mind on the task at hand. But Carlos, who had just finished his morning rounds, began to feel uneasy. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a nagging feeling tugged at him, like something dark was closing in. Then it happened. The sound of a distant explosion broke the quiet morning. It was the sound of the first wave of firebombs hitting the training building. The flames erupted suddenly, and thick black smoke poured into the sky. The dogs, startled by the noise, began barking wildly, sensing the danger. Carlos's heart raced as he looked toward the facility. He knew immediately what was happening. The cartel had struck. Panic set in as the trainers scrambled to evacuate the dogs from the burning building. But the fire spread quickly, and the heat was unbearable. Rex, hearing the chaos, turned and ran toward the smoke-filled facility, instinctively trying to help. Carlos shouted his name, trying to call him back, but it was too late. Rex was already inside, doing what he knew best, protecting the people he cared about. As the flames continued to rage, Carlos could only hope that Rex would somehow make it out alive. The bond between them was unbreakable, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing his partner. The battle had just begun, but the first strike had already been devastating. The flames from the burning K9 facility stretched high into the sky, painting the morning with a terrifying glow. The sound of crackling wood and the hissing of melting metal filled the air. But through all the chaos, there was one thing that stood out, the unmistakable sound of barking. It was coming from inside the burning building. Rex, the fearless German shepherd, had not backed down when the fire had begun. He had charged into the inferno, his instinct to protect the facility overpowering any sense of self-preservation. Carlos stood frozen for a moment, the sheer horror of the situation washing over him. His mind raced. He had to get in there. He had to find Rex. But the fire was too intense, the heat unbearable, and the smoke so thick it burned his eyes. His thoughts were clouded with panic. He had trained Rex from the very start, and the bond they shared was irreplaceable. Losing him was unimaginable. But even if Rex made it out, how could the dogs and trainers survive such devastation? Carlos snapped out of his daze and ran toward the building. He yelled for the others to help, but the fire had spread too quickly. They had no way of entering the building safely. Instead, they focused on getting the dogs that had already made it out of the building away from the flames, moving them to a safe distance. But Rex was still inside, his barking echoing through the thick smoke, signaling that he was trying to make his way through the hellish flames. The fire department arrived shortly afterward, but it felt like time was standing still. The firemen rushed to contain the blaze, but they had to wait for the flames to subside before attempting a rescue. Carlos didn't wait for them. His instincts kicked in, and he darted to the back of the building, hoping for an escape route. With each step, the heat grew more unbearable, and the smoke made it almost impossible to see. Inside the building, Rex was struggling, but his training kept him moving. He had heard the sound of the fire starting, but he hadn't hesitated. Even though his body was aching from the heat, he kept moving, determined to find a way out. He knew the layout of the facility better than anyone else. The building was large, with multiple rooms dedicated to different types of training. Rex navigated through them quickly, his sharp eyes scanning for any escape routes. But the smoke was thick, and the heat was starting to take its toll on him. His body began to feel heavy, his breath shallow, but his training kept him pushing forward. Rex made it to the back of the building, where a small exit door stood open just enough for him to squeeze through. He limped toward it, his body starting to burn with the effort, his fur singed at the edges. But just as he was almost at the door, a loud crash sounded from behind him. A wall of flames blocked the exit, forcing him to retreat into the center of the building. It was getting harder to breathe, harder to think, but Rex refused to give up. He could feel his strength waning, but his determination kept him going. Outside, Carlos could only watch in desperation as the fire raged. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. He was determined to save Rex, but how? The fire was too powerful, and the smoke was thickening with each passing minute. It was then that Carlos saw a figure emerge from the haze, a firefighter racing toward the building with a hose. His team had found a way to access the back of the facility, where a small service entrance led to the area Rex had been last seen. Carlos didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the firefighter, shouting to him, "My dog's still inside! He's in there! Please, you have to save him!" The firefighter nodded grimly, understanding the urgency. He signaled for Carlos to stay back, and they moved as quickly as they could, focusing on dousing the flames near the exit. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat was unbearable, but they pushed forward, determined to save the dog that had become a symbol of hope for the town. Inside the building, Rex's vision blurred as he stumbled through the smoke. He felt his body growing weaker. His mind becoming disoriented. He knew he had to keep moving, but just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he heard it, the sound of voices. Human voices. The firefighters were close, but the fire had taken so much of the building, and the walls were starting to collapse. Rex knew time was running out. With a final burst of strength, Rex pushed forward, ignoring the pain in his body. He heard the voices again, closer now. He could feel the cool air as they approached. But just as the wall of flames seemed insurmountable, a figure appeared in front of him. It was Carlos. Carlos had made it through the thick smoke and flames, and he reached out for Rex. "Come on, boy," Carlos shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Let's get out of here." Rex, with everything he had left, bounded toward Carlos, his tail wagging weakly as he neared the man he trusted above all else. Carlos wrapped his arms around the dog, pulling him close, and turned to head back toward the exit. But the fire wasn't done yet. As Carlos and Rex made their way towards safety, the building groaned under the pressure of the flames. The firefighters were working to keep the structure from collapsing, but the weight of the blaze was too much. As Carlos reached the door with Rex in his arms, a loud crash echoed through the building as part of the ceiling caved in behind them. They barely made it out in time. Rex was alive, but he was severely injured. His body was burned in several places, his fur singed, and his paws were blistered from the heat. Carlos knelt by his side, tears filling his eyes. "You did it, boy. You made it out. You're going to be okay," Carlos whispered, brushing the soot from Rex's fur, but the devastation of the fire was far from over. The canine facility had been destroyed. The dogs who survived were injured, their futures uncertain. The trainers, too, were shaken to their core. They had lost so much, but they hadn't lost hope. The fight was far from over. The cartel had made a grave mistake, and they would soon realize just how wrong they were to mess with these dogs. Rex's journey wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. The smoke was thick, and the charred remains of the K9 training facility smoldered in the distance as the firefighters worked to extinguish what was left of the blaze. Carlos knelt beside Rex, his hands trembling as he stroked the dog's singed fur. The once vibrant German shepherd, now covered in soot and ash, lay on the ground, breathing heavily but alive. His eyes, usually sharp and full of life, were clouded with exhaustion and pain. The bond between them, forged through countless hours of training and shared danger, had never felt stronger. In this moment, Carlos knew that Rex had saved him just as much as he had saved Rex over the years. Carlos gently helped Rex to his feet, his heart aching at the sight of his dog's injuries. Burns marred Rex's fur in several places, and his paws were raw and blistered from the heat. Despite the pain, Rex stood with his tail wagging weakly, his loyalty unwavering. He was a warrior, but even warriors needed time to heal. Carlos gave a silent nod to the paramedics, who were already preparing to take Rex to the local veterinary clinic for treatment. The damage done to the facility was devastating, and the trainers knew they would need to start over from scratch. But their priority was clear: save the dogs, and then rebuild. As the paramedics took Rex away, Carlos looked around at the devastation. The training facility that had been home to so many dogs and trainers was now a pile of rubble. The large open fields where the dogs once ran were scorched, the buildings reduced to ashes. The once bustling hub of law enforcement canine training was no more. But in that destruction, there was also a sense of determination, of resilience. Carlos knew that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. The cartel had made a grave mistake, and they would soon realize just how much they had underestimated the K9 unit. The fire they had set had not destroyed the spirit of the trainers or their dogs. It had only fueled the fire of vengeance and justice that burned within their hearts. The K9 unit had been crippled, but it had not been broken. They would rise again. Carlos spent the next several weeks with Rex, helping him recover from the physical wounds and the trauma of the fire. The veterinary team worked tirelessly to treat his burns, and although the physical scars would remain, Rex's spirit was unbroken. Every day, Carlos would sit with him, talking to him softly, encouraging him to get stronger. Slowly, Rex regained his strength, and with each passing day, he seemed more and more like his old self. His sharp eyes returned, his energy renewed. But something was different. There was a fire in him now, a hunger for justice. As Rex healed, Carlos began to think about what they could do next. The cartel's actions had left the town vulnerable, and the police force was stretched thin. The K9 unit had been one of their most valuable assets, and without it, the law enforcement officers were at a disadvantage. Carlos knew they had to rebuild, but they couldn't do it the same way they had before. The cartel had taken everything from them, and now it was time to take it back. In the months that followed, Carlos worked closely with the other trainers to prepare Rex and the surviving dogs for a new kind of mission. They didn't just need to train, they needed to evolve. The dogs had already been highly skilled in detection, apprehension, and tracking, but now they would be trained for something more: combat. The K9 unit would become not just a tool for law enforcement, but a powerful force of its own. The cartel had underestimated them before, but this time they wouldn't make that mistake again. The training was intense, more rigorous than it had ever been before. Carlos pushed Rex and the others harder than ever, demanding more from them. They practiced stealth missions, ambush tactics, and combat maneuvers. Every dog in the unit was pushed to their limit, but they all rose to the challenge. The bond between the trainers and the dogs deepened, as they shared not just the love and trust that had always existed, but now a shared sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for their town. They were fighting for justice, for the people who depended on them, and for the memories of those they had lost. Rex led the charge in this new phase of training. He was the strongest, the most skilled, and the most determined. His bond with Carlos was unbreakable, and together they led the other dogs through the brutal drills. Rex's loyalty and courage inspired the entire team. He had become more than just a dog. He was a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the K9 unit would rise again. As the dogs grew stronger, Carlos began to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. They were ready, more than ready, for the fight ahead. The cartel would not know what hit them. The K9 unit, stronger than ever, was preparing to strike back. But as the days passed, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the cartel was watching them, waiting for their next move. They knew they had made a powerful enemy, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Carlos couldn't afford to let his guard down. He knew that when the time came, it wouldn't just be about the dogs. It would be about the entire town, the trainers, the officers, and the community that had rallied behind them. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control, about ensuring that the cartel would never threaten them again. The stage was set. The K9 unit was ready, but there was one final piece to the puzzle that still needed to fall into place. It was time to strike back, and this time there would be no hesitation. The dogs, once trained for detection and apprehension, were now ready for war. Rex would lead them, and together they would take down the cartel, one mission at a time. The battle was coming. The fire had been lit, and nothing would stop them from putting it out. The dogs of the K9 unit were no longer just a tool. They were a force to be reckoned with. The air was heavy with anticipation as the K9 unit gathered in the makeshift training facility. that had been set up after the destruction of their original home. What remained of the facility was far from the ideal setting, but it was all they had. The trainers, now united by a common purpose, worked tirelessly with the dogs, ensuring that each one was prepared for the mission that was growing closer with every passing day. The fire that had torn through the original building had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something invaluable: purpose. Rex, now fully recovered from his injuries, stood among the other dogs. His once singed fur had grown back, his body strong and muscular, but it was his eyes that were the most telling. Gone was the soft innocence of a dog trained for detection and apprehension. In its place was a sharpness, a ferocity that made him seem almost otherworldly. His loyalty to Carlos, his handler, was unquestionable. But now Rex had another bond: the unwavering resolve to take down the cartel that had torn apart his world. Carlos stood nearby, watching Rex as the dog paced back and forth, his focus unwavering. The bond between them had only grown stronger since the fire. Carlos could feel the intensity in Rex's every movement. They were ready. This was more than just a training session. It was a preparation for the fight of their lives. Today, we're not just training for what's next, Carlos said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the words. We're training to bring justice to the people they've hurt. We're training to make sure they never think they can do this to us again. The trainers nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. The dogs, too, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. They had been through so much, but now they understood that this wasn't just about obeying commands. It was about survival. It was about making sure that the evil that had tried to destroy them would be eradicated once and for all. Carlos moved toward Rex, crouching down to meet his dog's intense gaze. The bond between them was palpable, and Carlos placed a hand on Rex's head, his fingers brushing through the fur that had grown back. He smiled slightly, knowing that his dog had become not just a companion, but a warrior. "Are you ready, boy?" Carlos whispered, his voice soft but filled with an undeniable conviction. Rex barked once in response, a sharp, strong sound that seemed to echo through the room. It wasn't just a bark, it was a declaration. Rex was ready, and he wasn't going to stop until the mission was complete. The training drills that followed were grueling, more intense than anything they had done before. The dogs moved with precision and agility, their bodies responding to the commands with near perfection. Rex led them, his every movement smooth and calculated, like a machine that had been built for this very purpose. The trainers pushed them harder than ever, each drill designed to prepare the dogs for the kind of confrontation they knew was coming. The focus of the day's exercises was on combat tactics. This was not about sniffing out drugs or apprehending criminals. This was about fighting. The dogs had been trained for many things, but now they had to learn how to face an enemy head-on, how to anticipate an attack, how to fight back with everything they had. They practiced takedowns, stealth maneuvers, and defense techniques, simulating everything from ambushes to counterattacks. Each exercise was designed to break them down and build them back up, making them stronger, faster, and more deadly. Rex, as always, was at the forefront. He attacked with an intensity that was unmatched by any of the other dogs. Every move was purposeful, every action driven by a single unyielding focus: to destroy the enemy. It was as if the fire that had nearly claimed his life had reignited something inside him, something primal and fierce that made him unstoppable. Carlos watched Rex's performance with pride, but there was also a sense of worry deep in his chest. This was not the kind of mission that could afford mistakes. The cartel would not hesitate to destroy them, just as they had destroyed the facility. They were ruthless, and their retaliation would be swift and deadly. The K9 unit had to be prepared for anything, and that meant pushing the dogs to their absolute limits. As the day wore on, the exercises grew more intense. The dogs were exhausted, but they refused to stop. They had become a family, bound together not just by the training they had undergone, but by the shared purpose of bringing down the cartel. The trainers knew They had to be ready for the ultimate challenge. The cartel would not go down without a fight, and they would likely face danger at every turn. The evening sun began to set as the final exercise of the day began. Carlos and the trainers had set up a mock ambush, simulating an attack by cartel members. The dogs were positioned around the area, ready to spring into action. The exercise was designed to test their ability to work together as a team, to use their training to outmaneuver an enemy force. Rex, as always, was the leader. "Ready, Rex?" Carlos asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Rex stood still for a moment, his muscles tense, his ears pricked. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he dashed forward, leading the charge. The other dogs followed in perfect formation, their movements synchronized as they moved toward their target. The mock cartel members, hidden behind cover, tried to fire back, but the dogs were too fast, too well trained. They moved with deadly precision, subduing the attackers one by one. The trainers watched in awe as Rex and the other dogs took down their enemies with ease. Every move was fluid, every takedown executed flawlessly. This was no longer just training, it was a preview of the real thing. The K9 unit was ready. They had become more than just a group of dogs. They had become a powerful force, a force that would stand up to the cartel and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. As the exercise ended and the dogs stood panting, their bodies covered in sweat, Carlos couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. They had come so far, from the ashes of the fire to this moment of triumph. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle awaited them, and it would be unlike anything they had faced before. The cartel would soon learn that they had made a mistake underestimating the K9 unit. Rex and his team were ready. This time, they wouldn't just be fighting for survival. They would be fighting for justice, for the people they had sworn to protect, and for the memory of all they had lost. The war had begun, and the K9 unit was leading the charge. The days following the intense training exercises were filled with a renewed sense of purpose for the K9 unit. The fire that had nearly destroyed them had, in many ways, forged them into something stronger, something more dangerous. Rex, the star of the team, had recovered from his injuries. But now the real challenge was ahead, to take down the cartel that had targeted them. The cartel was ruthless, and the trainers knew that any confrontation would be a test of not just their skills, but their will to survive. Carlos had always been confident in his bond with Rex, but now that bond felt more unbreakable than ever. The dog was no longer just a companion, he was a symbol of resilience and determination. Every day spent in training, every minute spent with the other dogs, deepened Carlos's belief in their mission. They weren't just going to fight back. They were going to make sure the cartel paid for everything they had done to them. The trainers worked tirelessly with the dogs, sharpening their skills for a mission that was now imminent. Each drill had a purpose, each maneuver a lesson. But this was no longer just about obedience or simple combat tactics. It was about preparing for a battle that would demand everything from them. This would not be the typical law enforcement operation. This was going to be a war. As the days passed, Carlos began to strategize with the other trainers. They couldn't go in recklessly. They had to be smart, precise. They would need to hit the cartel where it hurt, to cripple their operations, piece by piece, until the cartel no longer had the strength to retaliate. This wasn't going to be a quick battle. It would take time, patience, and stealth. But with Rex leading the charge, Carlos felt a growing sense of certainty. The cartel had made a mistake. They had underestimated the K9 unit, and now the dogs would show them just how wrong they were. Rex, as always, was the heart of the operation. Every time Carlos gave him a command, the dog responded with a level of focus and determination that was unmatched. It was as if the fire had unlocked something inside him, something primal that made him sharper, faster, more dangerous. The other dogs in the unit followed Rex's lead, their movements synchronized and seamless. Together, they had become a force that no one could ignore. The first target was a hidden drug shipment that the cartel had been using to funnel drugs into the region. The local authorities had intercepted a few leads, but they hadn't been able to get the evidence they needed to make a decisive strike. That's where the K9 unit came in. The dogs would be the key to locating the shipment and ensuring it was destroyed before it could reach its destination. Carlos, Rex, and the other trainers prepared for the mission, knowing that every detail had to be perfect. They spent days scouting the area, learning the terrain, understanding where the cartel would likely hide their shipment. It was a delicate operation. Too much attention, and the cartel would move their assets. But with Rex's nose for tracking and the team's expertise, Carlos knew they had a good chance of success. The night before the operation, Carlos sat with Rex outside the temporary facility, the cool air wrapping around them as they both prepared for what lay ahead. Rex rested his head on Carlos's lap, his eyes tired but filled with determination. "We're going to make it, boy," Carlos whispered, running his fingers through Rex's fur. "We've been through hell, but this is where we show them who we are." Rex's tail thumped softly against the ground, and he let out a low whine, as if he understood the weight of the words. The bond between them went beyond language. It was an understanding of what was at stake, an unspoken promise to protect one another, no matter the cost. The next day, under the cover of darkness, the K9 unit moved out. The plan was simple: find the shipment, eliminate any cartel members in the area, and ensure that the drugs were destroyed. Carlos, Rex, and the other dogs moved swiftly through the forest, their bodies low to the ground, blending in with the shadows. The scent of the shipment was faint but unmistakable, and Rex led the way, his nose twitching as he followed the trail. The dogs moved with incredible precision, each one playing a specific role. Some were tasked with guarding the perimeter, while others sniffed through the area for clues. Rex, as always, was the leader. He tracked the scent with unwavering focus, his every movement calm yet purposeful. It was clear that the fire had only strengthened his resolve. He was no longer just a dog doing his job. He was a warrior, and this was his battlefield. As the team closed in on the hidden shipment, Carlos signaled for them to pause. They had to move quietly now. The cartel members could be anywhere, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. The tension was thick in the air, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Rex's ears perked up, and he let out a soft growl, signaling that he had spotted something. Carlos moved closer to Rex, his heart racing. He knew that the next few minutes would determine the success of the mission. They were close, so close. The shipment was hidden in a cave just ahead, guarded by a few cartel members who seemed to be on high alert. It was a perfect setup for a quick strike. "On me," Carlos whispered to the team, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "We go in, we take them down, and we destroy the shipment." No hesitation. Rex's body tensed, ready to spring into action. The other dogs followed suit, their movements synchronized as they prepared to move in. Carlos looked at Rex one last time, his eyes locking with the dogs. In that moment there was no fear, no doubt. There was only the mission and the unwavering bond between man and dog. With a sharp command, Carlos led the charge. The dogs burst into the cave, their speed and precision taking the cartel members by surprise. The sounds of barking, growling, and gunfire filled the air as the K9 unit overwhelmed the cartel's guards. Rex, as always, was in the thick of it. He leapt onto one of the cartel members, pinning him to the ground with a strength that came from both his training and his fury. The man struggled, but it was no use. Rex was in control. Within moments, the cartel members were subdued and the shipment was secured. Carlos signaled for the team to destroy the drugs, ensuring that the cartel's resources would be crippled. As the team moved to finish the operation, Rex stood guard, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The mission was a success, but Carlos knew that this was just the beginning. The cartel had lost one shipment, but they would retaliate. This wouldn't be a simple fight, it would be a war. And the K9 unit, led by Rex, would be ready for whatever came next. The success of their first mission was a turning point for the K9 unit. The operation had gone exactly as planned. The drugs were destroyed, the cartel members apprehended, and a significant blow had been dealt to the cartel's operations. But while the victory was sweet, Carlos and the trainers knew that this was just the beginning. The cartel wouldn't take the loss lying down. In fact, they would be coming for revenge, and the K9 unit had to be ready for whatever came next. Carlos could feel the weight of the impending battle pressing down on him. The quiet, peaceful days of training had been replaced with the harsh reality of what was to come. The cartel was no longer just a criminal organization. They were a ruthless enemy that would stop at nothing to regain control. They had underestimated the K9 unit before, but now they were fully aware of the threat the dogs posed. Rex, as always, stood by Carlos's side, his loyalty unwavering. The bond between them had deepened since the fire, and Rex had become even more determined, if that was even possible. The fire had not only scarred Rex physically, but it had ignited something inside him, a primal hunger for justice that matched Carlos's own. Rex was no longer just a dog. He was a warrior, ready to take down the cartel piece by piece. The K9 unit's next mission was even more dangerous than the last. Intelligence reports suggested that the cartel was planning a major shipment of weapons, meant to arm their forces and tighten their control over the region. The K9 unit had to intercept it before it could reach its destination, but this would not be a simple task. The cartel had learned their lesson from the last attack, and they would be prepared. Carlos and the trainers gathered in their temporary base, a hidden location that they had set up for operations like this. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of determination. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The dogs were in top form, their senses sharp, their bodies lean and ready for the fight. Rex especially was on edge. He could sense that the stakes had been raised, and he was ready for whatever came next. Carlos sat in front of a map of the region, his finger tracing the possible routes the cartel's shipment might take. It was a delicate operation. One misstep, and the cartel would scatter, hiding their weapons in the shadows, making it impossible to find them. The team needed to be swift, precise, and most importantly, silent. They couldn't afford to alert the cartel to their presence. Rex would lead them, as he had before. His tracking ability would be the key to finding the shipment before the cartel could hide it. "Tonight we move out," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We've trained for this, and we know what we need to do. Rex, you're leading this mission. You know what's at stake." Rex barked softly, as if to acknowledge the importance of the mission. His gaze never wavered from Carlos, and for a moment it felt as though the two were communicating without words. Carlos had always known that Rex was special. The dog had an uncanny ability to understand situations, to sense danger before it arrived, and to act with a level of precision that made him an invaluable asset to the team. But tonight, that ability would be tested in ways it hadn't been before. As night fell, the K9 unit moved out. Carlos and the trainers led the dogs through dense forests, their movements swift and silent. The dogs, Rex at the forefront, moved with purpose, their senses heightened as they tracked the scent of the cartel's weapons shipment. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path, but the team was undeterred. They knew what they were here to do. Rex's nose was working overtime, sniffing the air as he picked up the faintest traces of the cartel's scent. His pace quickened, and Carlos followed closely behind, his eyes never leaving his dog. Rex was leading them in the right direction, but the closer they got, the more the air seemed to thicken with danger. The cartel was close, and they knew the K9 unit was hot on their trail. Hours passed as the team moved through the rugged terrain, but Rex didn't slow down. He was relentless, his nose cutting through the air like a blade. Carlos felt a mix of pride and apprehension. This wasn't just a training exercise anymore. This was real. They were about to face the cartel head-on, and there was no turning back. As they reached the clearing where the shipment was expected to be, Carlos gave the signal for the dogs to spread out and search. Rex led the way, his body low to the ground as he sniffed every inch of the area. The cartel had set up a temporary base in the middle of the clearing. their weapons stashed in several large crates. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and oil, but Rex wasn't fooled. He moved methodically, checking every corner of the area. Suddenly Rex stopped. His body tensed, his ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, signaling that he had found something. Carlos motioned for the team to close in quietly. The cartel members were scattered throughout the clearing, guarding the shipment, unaware that they were being watched. The K9 unit was positioned perfectly, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Carlos and the trainers had been working on stealth tactics for weeks, and now it was time to put them into action. The dogs moved quickly, silently, their bodies blending into the darkness as they circled the cartel's position. Rex, ever the leader, was the first to make a move. He lunged at one of the cartel members, knocking him to the ground before he had a chance to react. The sound of the struggle broke the silence, and the cartel guards sprang into action, reaching for their weapons. But it was too late. The dogs were already on them. In an instant, Rex and the other K9s had subdued the cartel members, their precision unmatched. The trainers moved in to secure the shipment, while the dogs kept the cartel members pinned to the ground, their jaws locked tight around their arms and legs. The mission had been a success, but as the K9 unit finished securing the area, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the cartel wasn't done yet. They had been hit hard, but they would regroup. The war was far from over, and the K9 unit had just made their enemies angrier. The next battle would be even more intense, and Carlos knew they had to be ready for whatever the cartel threw at them next. The K9 unit had taken another step forward in their fight against the cartel, but the real challenge lay ahead. The war was just beginning. The night had been a victory, but the sense of unease that followed was palpable. The mission had gone as planned. The K9 unit had successfully intercepted the cartel's weapons shipment, crippled their operation, and captured several key members. Yet Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was brewing. A storm. Hidden beneath the calm of their recent successes, the cartel had lost several important assets in the past few weeks, and now they were desperate. They weren't just criminals, they were a syndicate with deep roots, wealth, and power. Their retaliation wouldn't be a mere exchange of gunfire, it would be an all-out war. Carlos knew that the K9 unit, with its highly trained dogs, had already drawn the cartel's ire, but this time they would target them directly. There was no more subtlety or secrecy. The cartel would come after them, with everything they had. Carlos sat in a small, dimly lit room, looking over the reports. Rex, ever the loyal companion, lay at his feet, his eyes watching Carlos closely. The dog seemed to sense the tension in the room, his usually calm demeanor replaced with a hint of restlessness. Carlos sighed and ran a hand over his face. He had known from the beginning that the battle against the cartel would be fierce. But they were getting closer to something even more dangerous, a final showdown. The map in front of Carlos was littered with markings, each one representing a key target or lead. The K9 unit had been systematically dismantling the cartel's operations, but the deeper they went, the more they uncovered. It wasn't just drug trafficking or weapons smuggling. They were uncovering a network of corruption, violence, and destruction that had tentacles in every corner of the region. And now the cartel had gotten smarter. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were targeting the K9 unit directly. The intel was clear. The cartel had assembled a task force, a team of mercenaries trained to hunt down the very dogs that had brought them to their knees. The K9 unit was about to become the hunted, and Carlos knew that they had to prepare for a full-scale assault. "Rex," Carlos whispered, his voice barely audible. Rex lifted his head, his ears twitching, but he made no sound. Carlos stood up slowly, walking over to the window where the moonlight filtered through the blinds. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The K9 unit had become more than just a team of dogs. It had become a symbol of resistance. And now they were going to pay the price. The cartel's retaliation had already begun. The K-9 unit's operations had become more complicated. Every mission, every move was being watched. Carlos had received reports of ambushes in nearby towns, random attacks on innocent civilians, likely to draw attention away from their true target. But the K-9 unit knew that the cartel's next move would come for them. The cartel would try to break them, to destroy the trust between Carlos and his team. They would use fear, intimidation, and violence. The tension in the room was suffocating. Rex stood up and padded over to Carlos, his body close but not touching. The dog's silent presence was comforting, as if he understood what was coming. Together, they had faced countless dangers, and Rex had always been there. It was clear that this was going to be the biggest challenge they had ever faced. The next day, the K-9 unit went on high alert. The trainers knew it was only a matter of time before the cartel would strike with everything they had. Carlos met with the other trainers to discuss their strategy. This wasn't going to be a typical raid or mission. This would require them to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than ever before. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. "We're not going to wait for them to come to us," Carlos said, his voice low and determined. "We're going to take the fight to them. We'll split the unit, hit their locations, and take down their mercenaries before they can make their move." The trainers nodded, their faces grim. They knew the risks, but they also knew that there was no other choice. If they didn't strike first, they would be taken down one by one. The cartel had no hesitation, and neither would the K-9 unit. Rex was at the center of their plan. His tracking ability had been invaluable in previous missions, and now it would be even more critical. The team would need Rex to locate the cartel's hidden compounds, their weapons caches, and their mercenaries. But this time, it wasn't just about tracking. They needed to move fast, hit hard, and leave no trace. The cartel wouldn't know what hit them. The first mission of their counter-offensive was set for midnight. The dogs were ready, the trainers were prepared, and the plan was in motion. As the K-9 unit moved through the darkness, the night seemed unnaturally quiet, as though even the air itself was holding its breath. Rex led the way, his nose to the ground, his body poised for action. His every movement was fluid, precise, his senses sharp as a blade. Carlos walked just behind Rex, his thoughts focused on the mission. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now, when they were so close to their goal. The cartel had a base just outside the city, hidden in a dense forest that was nearly impossible to navigate. The K-9 unit had spent days studying the area, gathering intel, and preparing for the moment when they would strike. As they neared the compound, Rex slowed, his body tensing as he picked up on something. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of danger, mercenaries. The cartel had been one step ahead. They had anticipated the K-9 unit's move, and they had set a trap. But Rex, always alert, had sensed it just in time. Carlos signaled for the team to halt. The dogs stood still, their muscles coiled, ready for action. Carlos motioned for the trainers to take their positions. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. For a few tense moments, everything was still. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, without warning, gunshots rang out, followed by the growl of the dogs as they lunged toward the cartel's mercenaries. The battle had begun. The K-9 unit, led by Rex, charged into the fray, their attacks swift and lethal. The mercenaries were skilled, but they were no match for the precision of the dogs. Rex's movements were a blur of strength and speed as he took down one mercenary after another. His jaws locked around an enemy's arm, forcing him to the ground, while another dog tackled a second mercenary. The K-9 unit moved with a ferocity that was unmatched. These weren't just dogs. They were instruments of vengeance, trained to fight for survival. Carlos kept his eyes on Rex, moving with him, giving commands when necessary. But this was Rex's fight as much as it was his. They were in this together, and nothing was going to stop them now. The cartel had made their mistake. They had underestimated the K-9 unit, and now the cost of that mistake was coming due. The K-9 unit wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their town, for justice, and for the memory of all they had lost. The cartel would never take them down. Not now, not ever. The war was far from over, but the K9 unit was ready. The battle had been fierce, but the K9 unit had triumphed once again. The mercenaries who had been sent to stop them lay incapacitated on the ground, their weapons scattered and their plans shattered. Rex and the other dogs stood tall, their bodies covered in dirt and sweat, but their spirits unbroken. The K9 unit had just sent a message to the cartel. They weren't going to back down. They would keep fighting no matter how many obstacles were thrown their way, but the war was far from over. The cartel, now fully aware of the threat the K9 unit posed, would not be so easily deterred. Carlos knew that their victory tonight would only fuel the cartel's desire for revenge. They had struck a powerful blow, but they had also made an enemy that would stop at nothing to get even. Carlos looked at Rex, who was panting beside him, his eyes sharp as ever. Despite the battle they had just endured, Rex was ready for more. His bond with Carlos had only grown stronger in the heat of combat, and the two of them had become a team in every sense of the word. They had been through hell together, and yet they stood unshaken, united in their purpose. Tonight was just one victory, Carlos said quietly, his voice steady but filled with resolve. But we have to be prepared for what's coming next. The cartel will come for us, and when they do, we'll be ready. Rex let out a low growl, his eyes narrowing as if to agree with Carlos. The fight wasn't over, but they had made it this far, and they wouldn't stop now. The K9 unit was more than just a team of dogs. They were a force of nature, a living, breathing weapon forged in the fires of war. Together, they had faced down the cartel's best, and together they would face whatever came next. The next few weeks were filled with more intense preparation. Carlos and the trainers knew that the cartel's retaliation was imminent, and they had to be ready for anything. The K9 unit trained harder than ever, pushing the dogs to their physical and mental limits. The bond between the trainers and the dogs was stronger than it had ever been, and each day brought them closer to the final confrontation that loomed on the horizon. Rex, as always, was at the forefront. His body was lean and strong, his muscles honed through countless hours of training. But it was his mind that had evolved the most. Rex had always been intelligent, but now he was sharper, more focused. He had become more than just a dog. He was a strategist, a warrior, and a symbol of resilience for the entire K9 unit. His unwavering loyalty to Carlos and his determination to protect his team had become the cornerstone of the unit's strength. As the days went by, Carlos couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The K9 unit had been born out of necessity, a response to the cartel's growing power in the region. But now they had become something much bigger. They were not just a group of highly trained dogs. They were a symbol of defiance, of justice, and of the strength that comes from unity. The cartel had underestimated them before, and they would do so again. The final mission, the one that would decide the fate of the region, was fast approaching. Carlos had gathered the team one last time to go over the plan. This would be their most dangerous mission yet, an all-out assault on the cartel's main stronghold. The cartel had fortified its position in a remote location, a heavily guarded compound deep in the mountains. This would be a fight unlike any they had faced before. The K9 unit would have to infiltrate the compound, eliminate the cartel's leaders, and dismantle their operations once and for all. "We can't afford to make mistakes," Carlos said, his voice hard and resolute. "This is it. The cartel has been trying to break us, to scare us into backing down. But we're not going anywhere. But we're not going anywhere."